Well, it's my privilege to have Dr. Dale Thompson on the show today. Dale is one of the nation's most sought-after leadership consultants. He's known throughout the world for his ability to help leaders reach their full potential. And Dr. Thompson has more than 30 years of experience in leadership consulting, and today he's graciously agreed to be on the show and share some of his wisdom with us. Dale, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Now, you have an incredible consulting agency called Leadership Worth Following, but that name is intentional because you've spent years and years working on this concept of worthy leadership. Talk to me a little bit about what worthy leadership is.
Well, let's start with where it came from. Back in the 1990s, I was working with a prominent consulting company, and we had done as many as 10,000 executive assessments, and we ran into a period in our history, our business history, where in my own practice, I had as many as 9 executive clients derail and experience catastrophic failure. And for me, catastrophic failure is different than common failure. Common failure is just when someone's not smart enough, doesn't work hard enough, all the common things that happen, and we have a lot of that in business, and that's fairly normal. But in this case, these were about 9 senior executives who, despite many of them being among the very, very best of our 10,000 assessments, failed catastrophically, and in some cases, their organizations failed to exist after they failed. The paradox of scoring so well in our assessment processes and doing so poorly in their actual leadership role and impacting so many people inside their company, their vendors, their communities. We just saw devastating negative impacts of these failures. That's why we call them catastrophic failures. Led us to start really thinking about, so what did we get right in these assessment processes coming out of the 90s, and what did we get wrong? And as it turned out, in 2004, we founded a firm called Leadership Worth Following. We felt leadership should be worth following. And the idea was to really attack what happened in the 90s and say, certainly everything we did back then was not bad or wrong. And in fact, our research showed that we were almost exactly right, but we missed something really important, and that is the whole concept of character. So in the 90s, we got very, very good at assessing capacity, in particular capacity. Can they think well? Can they vision well? Can they communicate well? Do they have the right knowledge? And are they resilient kinds of leaders who can lead organizations? That's what really assessment in the 1990s was focused on. There was some work around what we call commitment, which is what do people care about? And that's, things like excellence and people and learning and stakeholders. But we really codified that quite a bit more. And so worthy leadership is asking the good from the past, primarily capacity, and then increasing our commitment to commitment, and then also dealing with the new issue of character. It's interesting because in every workshop I've ever done for 30 years, I ask people who what do they like about their leaders. They always talked about character, but we never did in the science side of things, at least not very much. And we really codified 9 factors of character that it turns out really helped us avoid catastrophic failures in leadership going into the 2000s.
So it's interesting that you contrast capacities and character. You're saying in the 90s, we really were concerned about what a person's capacities were. And I think obviously that's always going to be a part of how people are assessed. But you were saying that we not included character. Is character more important than capacities? Is it true that you're finding out that when people have really strong character, they sort of outperform their resume, and that when they don't, they underperform their resume? Or is it just that we were excluding it and we should have included it?
Well, actually, they do not outperform. What our research is showing is that, probably about 95% of success is still based in capacity and commitment. Now, let's add commitment there. Capacity was, we've done a lot in the past, but commitment, what do they care about again? So what we showed in our research was that commitment to excellence, a commitment to people and relationships, a commitment to learning and personal growth, and a commitment to stakeholders, 5 groups in particular, really differentiated performance there. But when we have high capacity and high commitment, we have about 95% chance of success. The other 5% is just going to be common failure that will happen in, it's just the normal course of events. But what you get with high assessment and character is you do not get more success, you get the absence of catastrophic failure, and that's the differentiator.
You said there are 9 character points. Could you just cherry pick a few of those and talk to us about those so we could get a clear formation in our mind of what we're talking about?
Sure, absolutely. So there's 9, what our research has shown is that there are 9 attributes of character that make a huge difference. The first 3 are around personal integrity and ethics. So personal integrity, do people let their yes be yes, their no be no? If they change their mind, do they tell somebody? Ethics, that is acknowledging there's a higher standard of rules than just what we might want to do for ourselves, and openness. This first cluster, personal integrity, ethics, and openness are fairly common and have been talked about a fair amount. The second cluster is really around what we call organizational integrity, courage, and power. Organizational integrity has to do with making sure that we're calling our companies out if we aren't doing what we say we do. So if a company says we don't pollute, or a company says we have good financial standards, those kinds of things, we hold our company to those. If you look at the Enron example in particular, especially the last year before they went out of business, their annual report was all about kind of financial reporting and integrity and all those kinds of things. And when you listen to the hearings from the Enron hearings that came after the collapse of the company, everyone said, I have strong personal integrity, and many of them probably did. But what they didn't have was organizational integrity. That is, they didn't call the company out around this notion of we weren't doing what we said we were going to do. And that's just critical. So we call that organizational integrity. It's sort of the counterpart to personal integrity. The second part of this cluster has to do with courage. So courage has to do with having the courage to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right, or to call things out, or to bring issues to light in appropriate ways. And then the third part of this cluster is around power, and power has to do with not abhorring power, but knowing that you have, as a leader, as an executive, you have power, but using it to protect others, using it to move things along appropriately, and not abusing that sense of power. And then the third cluster is around humility, gratitude, and forgiveness. And this was something that was hard to find in our research and tease it out, and we put it in there on a little bit of a flyer because it just seemed, when we look at these case studies of catastrophic failure, it oftentimes was a failure of humility, that is, thinking more of myself, so the arrogance would be the counterpart to this. But the idea that people think more of themselves than other people in an arrogant kind of way. Gratitude, which is being willing to be positive and aspirational and affirm what's good. And oftentimes the opposite of gratitude has to do with sort of having more of an anger and a deficit model that kind of hammers home and creates a culture of unsafety on leadership teams and in cultures. And then forgiveness. And this has been a really interesting one, this issue of forgiveness, because initially what we thought it had to do with was forgiving quickly when people offended us, or there was things that were people made mistakes and were we quick to forgive. And what we found in our follow-on work here is that great executives don't just forgive easily. They don't get offended in the first place, so they need to forgive. And when you find those kinds of leaders, you tend to find more open cultures, more free flow of information, more trust, higher commitment, higher engagement, and it just tends to be a better place to work. People want to go to work. So again, there's 9 attributes of character that we look at: personal integrity, ethics, openness, organizational integrity, courage and power, and humility, gratitude, and forgiveness. And we find that any one of those is really, really a problem for a person. They will likely fail at some point, and oftentimes will fail catastrophically.
I really like what you said about forgiveness, and I want to back up to that for just a second. So how does a person develop this ability to roll with, because that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, is that these individuals roll with things rather than take personal offense at them and get sort of absorbed in them. They have the ability to just keep on going down the road rather than take offense to things. What's your take on how people develop that quality?
Well, that's a really tricky one. What we find is that as leaders grow, and as they go up in organizations and acquire more power or more status or more scale or more people or more dollars or more sales, what happens is their jobs become more a matter of balance and paradox. That is, people who are younger in our careers succeed by working hard, staying focused, achieving something in particular. But as you go up the organization, finding those ideal solutions is almost impossible. And in fact, we talk about the role of leadership is to know, understand, and balance what's important on a real-time basis. The idea is, again, to know, understand, and balance what's important on a real-time basis. And what we find in senior leaders is oftentimes they're trying to hold on to something that worked for them earlier in their careers. So, for instance, we know that who becomes a leader, well, one of the big attributes of who becomes a leader is those who want it the most. That is, they're dominant, they're aggressive. They really want to put points on the board either for themselves or for the organization or whatever. But there's a sense of dominance. And they try to bring that dominance all the way up. And somewhere in the middle there, the idea of collaboration and being a leader from the back or a leader from the side becomes way more important. And what we find is in some leaders, they do make it all the way to CEO using this sort of more dominant, aggressive, judgmental kind of leadership style. And those kind of leaders oftentimes have a hard time with forgiving mistakes. They see things that don't go right and people that don't do what they want as personally irritating to them, and they sort of jump on that and try to stomp it out, and it creates a culture of fear and intimidation. And oftentimes those cultures, the only way they hold people is to pay large sums of money to people to stay with them. But people don't stay because they want to. They feel they stay because they have to, and those cultures oftentimes are not sustainable. One of our 9 case studies was around a leader that we worked with fairly intensely. And he came in for his assessment, and when I was working with him, I just had something that bothered me, and something as we were interacting. I finally turned to him and I said, "Can you tell me about your philosophy of forgiveness?" A very unusual question I never asked before in an assessment process. And this man, who was a large man, more than 6 feet tall, more than 300 pounds, powerful man, physically powerful man, and he started weeping. And over the course of the next couple hours, what we talked about was a life filled with offense. And what he told me at one point was that in his lower left-hand desk drawer, he had a file. And in that file, he kept a list of every person who ever offended him, and the date, what the offense was, and how he got even. And I thought this can't be true. And so the next time I was at their job site, I went and sat in his office, and I opened his lower left-hand desk drawer, and sure enough, here was this file. This person was in his 40s, early 50s at this point, and the file was over an inch thick, and it literally was a legal pad that he filled in every day with who offended him, who crossed him, who made him angry, and the data there. What's interesting is within a couple of years later, he actually was indicted on some charges, which I'm not going to go into here. But interestingly, also he was at a health club one day working out in the morning. He's quite overweight, and he actually dropped dead. And they had just installed the AEDs, the devices, and they brought him back, and he ended up being convicted and being on home arrest and dying not that long afterwards. But I really think this whole issue of these resentments and this seething anger towards people who do what he wanted actually killed him. And paradoxically, he was one of the finest leaders of scale the world has ever seen. But the way he did that came at such enormous cost to himself, and frankly his organization and lots of people who worked with him. Is when he went down, a lot of people went down with him, and this was just really a modern tragedy in leadership.
Well, kind of turning a corner to some of the really applied aspects of this, because I know we have quite a few people who listen to the podcast that are involved in hiring, and so there's always a question, is this something we can screen for? So when you're talking about the importance of character, is this something that you can screen for in the hiring process, and how would you do that if you can?
Well, I think it's absolutely something that you can screen for, but it is very tricky. And one of the problems that we have with it is that catastrophic failure is a relatively rare event. So when the base rate is very low, it's hard to know exactly what you should be using to predict it for, because what'll happen is if you're not careful, you end up with lots of false positives. That is, you will have lots of indications that this could be a problem, and a lot of those may never come to pass or may come to pass several years later. The second one of our case studies was an executive who was just an exemplary executive, worked in the finance area, eventually got into operations, and in his assessment process, what we would talk about, what came up one day was he said, for instance, I worked the first 8 hours a day to keep up with my peers. I worked the second 8 hours to stomp my peers.
Wow.
And he actually used the word stomp, which is very, very aggressive. And so I think that was an indicator, a tip-off, that there was a character issue here. And in fact, we addressed it as a character issue in his assessment. And several years later, he actually literally went to jail, when he was trying to negotiate a government contract. And in negotiating the contract, he actually offered the contracting agent a job after she left the government if she would give him this contract for his company. And I mean that's an absolutely clear violation of federal law. And the Fed, when the government found out about it, they were both indicted. They both went to jail. And what he said in sort of defending himself, he came out of jail. He did one of these CNN kind of interviews, and he said that his only mistake was he was a little bit impulsive. Well,
maybe a little more than that.
I guess you could. Maybe a little more than that, but he was brilliant also, and so he's a very smart guy. So these catastrophic failures of leadership are very, very subtle to figure out. So I do like things like the California Psychological Inventory. There's some scales on there around responsibility, socialization, and self-control. Responsibility is a conscientiousness kind of scale. Socialization is sort of people that accept rules as important. That gets back to our ethics kind of piece of our model. And self-control, will they be sort of impulsive or are they prone to make mistakes by being impulsive? What's interesting is low scores on those three scales, so low in conscientiousness, low in sort of rule acceptance and low on impulsiveness, aren't necessarily bad traits in and of themselves. So for instance, when you see that pattern, oftentimes you will see a hyper creative, innovative change agent who just doesn't accept things the way they are and has an ability to kind of formulate new ideas that can change the world. But when you do see that profile, you should also take a look to see what kinds of mistakes are they likely to make, and do they have a self-awareness about the kinds of mistakes that they tend to make. And so on the normal personality side, those things tend to really matter. And then there's other kinds of things you can look at, but primarily when you're assessing, and so another thing we do in our own practice is that we have whole sets of business simulations, and in these business simulations we have lots of sort of challenges, some of them extremely subtle and some of them extremely transparent. So, a woman's filed a sexual harassment complaint. What do you do with it? That might be really obvious, but there might be something far more subtle, something around a policy or something about a communication or something about being open, where you sort of begin to see a pattern of behaviors that goes, this person might actually make some pretty big mistakes, but these are predicting the catastrophic failures are difficult. The ones around sort of resentment and anger and aggressiveness, you can get those pretty directly, but some of them can be quite subtle.
So screening, it sounds like there's some good instruments and some good tools that can be used for that. What about, I know that your world is coaching and consulting. How do you deal with that brilliant leader who is so good at the tasks they do, the sort of the capacities things that we talked about
what
before.
They do.
But they need to develop this character side, especially for those who are listening to our podcast that are leaders of leaders, and they find themselves having to sit down sometimes with, perhaps middle level management and saying, we've got to work on some of these issues. How do you help someone develop in these in crucial aspects of character?
Well, I think one of the first ways we do it is we teach them a kind of a new model of integrity. So if we back up to integrity for a moment here, integrity is usually thought of, does your behavior follow your words? Do you do what you say you're going to do? Is there a clear connection between my behavior and my words? And that's all well and good, but oftentimes what you end up there is with people who are attaching behaviors to their intentions that may not be as effective as they really are, and you'll see that in the 360 feedback and whatnot. And so one of the ways we get people, even these hardcore kinds of fix-it coaching kind of situations, one of the places we start typically is we get them to think a lot about what do I stand for and what do I want to stand for, and how would anybody know? And it's interesting because most leaders have a pretty easy time saying, I stand for integrity, and I stand for hard work, and I stand for results, and I stand for people, and all these kinds of things. And so that they can go on for quite a few minutes talking about these very noble kinds of things or these very company-focused kinds of things that they want to stand for. But then when you press them a bit more and you say, but how would anybody know you stand for those things? Oftentimes the discussion is very short, and they have not thought that through. And so I think one of the places you start with even middle managers is what do you want to stand for as a leader? And then helping them figure out, so what if you want to stand for those things, then how do you do those things? And when that process then kind of takes hold, we call that the alignment phase of coaching. That is, do my behaviors align with my intentions, and am I getting the kind of impact I want to have? But then you take this a step farther, and actually I go a step farther these days with most executives, and I say, well, let's redefine integrity here a little bit. And what I mean by that is instead of aligning their intentions and their words with their behaviors, I try to get them to align their intentions and their words with their impact. And then oftentimes what that does is unleash them to become much more flexible in changing their behaviors. Most of us do what we do because it's easy or we know to do that. And so people have a hard time deciding what to do differently. But if you get them focused on the impact they're having, and you can get that through 360s, you can get that through interviews, you can get that through asking for feedback. For instance, one of the things I always do at the end of almost every meeting I ever have with a client is, what can I do more of, less of, or keep doing to have a better impact for you personally? And they're not used to answering that question, but I seek that feedback in every single meeting. And they get used, they know the question's coming, and so they'll help me, they will teach me how to have the impact I'm intending. And when you have alignment of words and intentions with impact, I think that's a much higher order personal integrity that really does change the world. But in our coaching model, there are three phases. If I can kind of go this direction, though, is it okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in our coaching model, we talk about coaching as occurring in three phases. The first phase is align. Align is aligning our behavior with our intentions to have the maximum positive impact. And to do that, we teach people how to get very clear about their intentions, very, very observant of their impact, and very flexible about their behavior. And this just causes revolutionary changes for people. And in our world, there's several different kinds of coaching. One's kind of aspirational coaching. That's everybody wants those people because they're high talent and they're growing quickly. You want to take them forward. But I actually enjoy fix-it coaching way more, because I find in almost every case of fix-it coaching, there's a lot in people's intentions and their goals and how they're feeling about things and what they want to do that I really like, but they don't know how to do it. And so if I can get them to align their behaviors with their intentions to have a maximum positive impact, if they can get alignment across that, then you've changed the world for them, but not people and oftentimes their companies. Now, when that starts to work right, what they start to do is they go, what else could I be intending, Dale? What else could I accomplish? And I call this phase aspire. And so in a line, I try to take the goals they have, their intentions that they have, at face value and help them achieve those. In aspire, we start exploring how much bigger an impact could they have. And this sort of ratchets everything up. And oftentimes that's a transition phase to the third phase of coaching, which we call transform. In transform, think about this as sort of being the narcissistic phase of coaching. That is, in coaching, it's so much about them and their intentions and their behavior and their impact. It's very narcissistic by its very nature. And what we try to do in this third phase of transform is we try to transition them away from narcissism and a focus on others. And so how do they help others do the same thing they've been through? And so we sort of make them coaching of coaches, and so they work with their people and the people around them to help them to develop these kinds of skills, which kinds of gives it away. And these people have a fun at this point because leadership becomes quite a bit easier because they're not working so hard to overcome their own inadequacies. They've got their leadership philosophy and skills not enough worked out, and helping other people really become who they can be. And that's just a blast when you get into there. And what's really fun about this, Jonathan, is that these three phases kind of they're natural and they follow one another naturally. So when I'm successful, I feel good. When I'm successful, I want to do more. And usually that more becomes a higher order more, not just more of the same, but more of different at a higher order. And then I want to give it away. And so in a lot of ways, we're just putting words to a natural process of development.
So do you find that sometimes people get a little offended when you have to talk about areas that need improvement with terms that are kind of loaded like this? Integrity, we're talking about a person's forgiveness style and those sorts of things. I could imagine that, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's already a little stressed because they're sort of getting some coaching about their leadership style, they could maybe take offense to the idea that they have some issues in these areas. How do you navigate that successfully?
Well, that's really funny you would go there because I would say the first half of my career was hallmarked by hypocrisy. And what I mean by that is I would go into a room and usually they had just been talked to by one of their supervisors or HR or something and had been told that they need to do coaching and they've got a resource they're going to want them to meet with, and so they'd go from that room into a room where I was and walk in and, hello, my name is Dale, I'm here to help. And they'd walk in and a lot of times with a fair amount of hostility and anger, of course.
Sure.
Having gotten these messages would say to me something like, so you're here to fix me. And I'd spend the next couple hours trying to convince them that, oh, no, I'm not here to fix you, when actually that's exactly what I was there for. And that always bothered me, and we usually got through that pretty well, but it felt kind of icky, and it felt kind of deceptive, and it just didn't feel authentic, because in a lot of ways I was supposed to be there to fix them.
Sure.
And somewhere around 15 years ago or so, 15 to 20 years ago, I changed how I handled that meeting. And what I say now is, in that if I'm confronted with that kind of situation, is no, I'm here to help you do what you want to do and be who you want to be. And they're not prepared for that kind of answer. Help you do what you want to do and be who you want to be. And then we spend the next couple hours exploring what they want to do and who they want to be. And again, Jonathan, frankly, I like these people because oftentimes they are talented, they are passionate, they are driven, they want to make a difference. But what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do that doesn't work very well. And I'm really good at helping them. In our field, we're really good at helping people figure out how to do those things well. And so this is a platform for us to just use our skills to help them become much more sophisticated, much more seasoned in how they approach things. In fact, I even think of coaching as helping the seasoning process. So the way I think about this is that a seasoned executive is someone who accomplishes more with less effort and fewer mistakes.
I love that definition.
Thank you. So what does a coach do? It helps an executive accomplish more with less effort and fewer mistakes. And I'm also sort of radical about coaching in this sense too. A lot of people spend enormous amounts of time contracting and writing things up and non-disclosures and all this kinds of stuff. I just think that's a horrific waste of time and bad process, frankly. And so I am of the opinion, and I'm a little radical here, but we ought to be able to change people's lives in one meeting. And so if you start a meeting with this idea of what do you want to do and who do you want to be, you can work some of that in that very first time you're with somebody and give them some ideas. And typically they'll go off and try something, and I say, if you want to meet again, let me know. And usually my phone rings in about 2 days. And then we schedule another meeting. And while I don't think coaching should go on forever, I've got a lot of clients who I've been seeing off and on for years. But it's always around this issue of what do I want to do and who do I want to be, and how do I become more seasoned? How do I accomplish more with less effort and fewer mistakes? And in that kind of environment, people grow quickly, and it's a positive experience. And again, I love the fix-it coaching cases because these are bright, talented, driven, motivated people that want to make a difference but don't know how, and that's where we can change the world.
Well, what I love about what you're saying is that as somebody who, in my role at the church that I serve, I've supervised staff before, and I think whenever you have to talk about a challenge or an issue with someone who works on your team, I think it's very easy, at least it has been for me, to develop a sense of anxiety and trepidation about that meeting, and to worry about how is this going to be received by this person, and to sort of get all wrapped up in that. When what I love about what you're saying is that these coaching meetings are an opportunity to help unlock the potential that this individual has. Something is blocking them, something's making it difficult, but that potential is already there. And so it sounds to me like there's almost a sense in which there's part of almost a brainstorming here that happens that says, I'm going to come alongside you. We're going to figure out what's the roadblock in the way of you realizing your potential that you want to head toward, so that maybe cooperatively together we can figure out how can we remove some of those barriers and help you be successful.
Absolutely right. And what's so important here is that you're not carrying necessarily the agenda of the organization, which sounds hypocritical also. But when I go into those situations, I have a long list of things the company wants to be different. But I don't walk in there and say, here are the things that the company wants us to fix. I mean, who'd want to grow in that kind of environment? But I find if I start at the other end with them about what they want to do, who they want to be, and work forward, those things that the company wants to deal with always come out, and they always come out quickly. But it's coming out from a place of the person having some control, having some sense that they are respected and respectable. And it's much more positive in coming forward, and they'll quickly say, what do you think about this, or how would you do that, or what kind of skills should I think, or what should I read, or what should I do differently, and so it becomes problem solving, but on their agenda, on their time frame. This is a good point also for me to mention something else, and that is that a lot of times in these fix-it coaching in particular, these people get labeled as bad people. And that's why they're doing this. So there's an attributional error kind of thing going on where we want to quickly say this is a bad person at some deep character level, and we should just be fired or just be thrown away or just be cast off. Interestingly, I've been doing this exact work since February 1st, 1982. So that's a lot of years. That's 37 years. And in that time, I have only refused to work with about 8 people. And the difference between those 8 people and everybody else is I think those 8 people really did have bad intentions and wanted to do bad things. So, for instance, one of them said to me point blank, I'll do coaching with you, Dale, but your goal is to teach me how to manipulate my boss better.
Wow.
And I went, I think we're done.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's that kind of stuff. But that gives you a sense of how low the base rate is for evil or negativity, a kind of negativity that you don't want to empower. I don't want to empower negative people or evil people or bad people to do bad things. And certainly we could do that. And so you have to be just discerning about, this is why I want to start with, What do you want to do? Who do you want to be?
Right.
And if that rings true, then we're all in to help them grow and develop.
In the psychology world, we call that intrinsic motivation, right? We're talking about what are you naturally motivated to do? And I love that because, we talk about the fact that when somebody is motivated from outside, when they're doing stuff just because they think somebody else wants them to do it, it's going to be time limited. It's never going to be satisfactory, and it's going to reduce their capacity to perform in other areas. So I love what you're saying about tapping into what is it that they ultimately want to do. And as you said, so long as it's not damaging, it may be a powerful tool to find that alignment that you're talking about. If we can find the common ground between what we need to do and what they want to do, then we may really end up in that life in the fast lane. Now we're actually getting traction and getting somewhere.
It has staying power and scales, and it transcends, and you can teach other people. So this is exactly right. And then I can come back to this phrase of change the world. Back in 2004, when we founded Leadership Worth Following, we had a board meeting, and we wrote this idea of our mission statement, our vision being changing leadership, changing the world. And here we are, this tiny little group at that point with no intellectual property and no people and no clients and nothing. And we tore that piece of paper off the flip chart and threw it in the corner of my office. And a year later, we still didn't have the vision statement that we liked, and so we went over and picked up this piece of paper off the floor, smoothed it back out, put it back on the board, and we looked at it and said, let's do this. Changing leadership, changing the world. And when we operate from this kind of mentality, what happens is even though we're a small group of people, these are powerful ideas that scale. And it's so fun now because one of our clients is a giant client, huge, multinational corporation, and we've done so much work there the last 7-8 years that when a new client comes and starts working with us, they'll inevitably start trying to teach us what they believe about leadership, and what they're giving us back is our own concepts. And so we're teaching people are teaching other people, teaching other people, teaching other people, and now when these people come around for their own growth experiences, they're now bringing that back to us and saying, have you thought about seasoned leadership being accomplished more with less effort and fewer mistakes? And they go, we delight. We say, what a great
wonderful idea.
That's just fantastic. Or whenever one of our ideas, the things we teach a lot is go slow to go fast. These people are very urgent kinds of people oftentimes. What we teach them is how to go slow, which lets them go fast with what they're trying to accomplish. And they come back and they start teaching us these concepts. And it's like, then we know this thing is scaling. We know this thing works. We know it will scale and change the world. And that's our goal.
I love that. Well, last question for you, Dale, and that is this. I have a lot of listeners who are they're at the top level in their organization, so I suppose they're overseen by their board or so forth, but they don't get a lot of direct coaching. They have to do a lot of self-coaching. So I guess my last question would be, if you have a leader who's the head of an organization doing well, but wanting to continuously develop, as all great leaders do, how does that person self-coach on this issue of character? What's a little homework they could use leaving this episode, having heard this episode? What's a little homework assignment they could do to help them be working on this important issue of character?
Well, I think the issue actually is a bit bigger than that. What I've become enamored of over the years is coaching leaders to be simply inquisitive. Simply inquisitive. A lot of leaders are out of time, they're out of money, they've got boards harping at them, they've got shareholders harping at them, they have other things outside of their job, kind of driving them crazy. And I think the thing that I really would like leaders to protect and nurture is taking time to be simply inquisitive. And that means being willing to read, being willing to listen, being willing to watch, being willing to ask questions, being willing to not have the answers. And as you do that, to your question in particular, is I think we have to be honest with ourselves. And I was interviewing a CEO at a conference recently, and he was going on and on in just a powerful, motivating, energizing way, talking about this, how he's transforming individuals, teams, even a country. He's actually building businesses in Mexico that are beginning to transform the country of Mexico. This is heady stuff. And at one point in the interview, I stopped and I said, "Can you tell me about a moment when you have felt hypocrisy between your intentions here and what you're actually doing?" And I cringed as I asked that question in front of a large audience. It had not prepared him for that. And he laughed and he rocked back in his chair and he went, "You mean like yesterday?" I said, "That would work." And he went on to tell a story about how he was in a meeting in a crisis kind of situation, and he did not act in his philosophy. And he realized it fairly quickly and caught himself, but he still had done the damage, and he had to do an apology. And he realized that while his aspirations and his intentions were noble and correct, and by the way, and powerful business concepts, as a leader, we're all still human beings.
Yes.
And I think we have to be aware of ourselves and aware that when what we say, do, think, feel does not match the best of our intentions. And we have to be we have to learn how to recognize that in the moment even. And if not in the moment, at least in reflection, and then go back and clean it up. I call it clean it up. Because people are willing to let us be human, and apologies do work and those kinds of things. But we have to be self-aware. We have to be willing to see the contrast between our intentions and our own behavior, and then call it out. But to do that, we have to also be inquisitive about ourselves and our intentions, inquisitive about just things in general. So this idea of inquisitiveness is big, and the idea of being willing to always be watching ourselves, be sure we're doing what we say we intend, and avoiding that hypocrisy as much as possible.
Well, I've loved this. I've learned a ton just listening to you talk. And by the way, listeners, I had a chance to stop by the Leadership Worth Following booth at the conference where I met Dale. And I'm so impressed with this organization and with their people. And so Dale is a tremendous resource just beyond what the brief podcast that you've heard here. And his organization is just top notch. So, Dale, I just want to thank you for being on this show. What a privilege and blessing it's been to talk with you today. And thank you so much for the insights that you've shared.
My pleasure. I hope people got something from it, and we can all scale our impact and change the world. Thank you so much.